Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this campfire chat organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative on the role of trees in large-scale carbon dioxide removal. We have a fantastic set of speakers, guests with us who will share their experience. We planned for 5 and we got 6 because one of our team has decided to make the team even stronger. Thank you very much to WRI in China. I will ask them in a moment to introduce each of them. I just wanted to remind everybody that we hope to have a real discussion around a virtual campfire. So there will not be long speeches, there will be a few introductory remarks, and then we look forward to a discussion between the participants. And then toward the last third of this session, of the 60 minutes that we have, we will open for a question and answer session with the participants. For the participants to this event, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom application to post your questions. And if you see a question there that you already like, then please vote for it, because that will raise it in the priority list and the chances of it being addressed will be much higher. My name is János Pásztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G. We're a small foundation-funded initiative, and our focus, our mission, is to catalyze the creation of effective governance on these new emerging climate-altering technologies like carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. It's important to mention that we're not here to promote those technologies. We're impartial about their use or non-use. One part of our strategy is to encourage conversations like the one we're about to have, because these conversations are a very important part of governance. We don't look at governance as just actions that governments do. Of course, in terms of the topic of this discussion, the role of trees in large-scale carbon dioxide removal, we know, and we've known from the IPCC for some time, that they are necessary. But how much, which technology, which approach, when do you apply them? Those are the part of the governance debate that we need to have. And especially nature-based technologies, nature-based approaches like afforestation, reforestation are and will be part of the solution. But the question is, what exactly is their role? What are the benefits? What are the risks? How to manage to maximize the benefits and minimize the trade-offs? And these are the big questions for which we need governance, because under good governance, we will be able to address those to the maximum benefit of society. So I will stop here. Our guests know much more about this topic than I do, so it's better if I leave time for them. I will now ask each guest to introduce themselves and to say why they're interested in this topic and raise one important topic rather, that they would like to be addressed. So with that, let me start with Thelma, please. Thermakrug, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, János. Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. My name is then Thermakrug. I am presently the Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And before that, I was also a researcher at the National Institute for Space Research here in Brazil. And just on a last note, before I retired last year, I was director in the Department of Policies to Combat Deforestation in the Ministry of the Environment, just to link me to trees.
But please also go ahead, Thelma, and introduce your first topic at the same time.
Okay, so let me introduce my theme. So basically, why do we need, CDR, the carbon dioxide removal at all? Why do we talk also about large-scale CDR? So in this regard, I would like to refer to the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was approved by the member governments of the IPCC in October 2018. And in this report, we addressed, or the IPCC addressed, emission pathways to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels until the end of the century. So in all the assessed pathways of the IPCC, the CO2 emissions are reduced to net zero globally around 2050. So this is a real challenge, since for some sectors, in particular energy, I would say, transport, this might be very difficult to be achieved. So we would need to have efforts to compensate these so-called residual carbon dioxide emissions. And then we would need to have efforts to be implemented in that regard. And also in some of the pathways that IPCC has assessed, before 2100, the end of the century, we may face temperature increase or warming be above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then we would need a lot of effort to bring the temperature increase below that, so that we would limit the global warming to 1.5. And these pathways that go beyond 1.5, we call them overshoot pathways. Obviously, the more overshoot we have, the more excess of 1.5 temperature we have, the more we will require in terms of efforts to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And there are several options that are being discussed to achieve this. So the integrated assessment models that have been assessed in the 1.5 special report relied more on two options of CDR. Basically the BECCS, the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and also afforestation and reforestation. So the scale and type of CDR vary widely across these 1.5 pathways, and also have different consequences for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So on a final note, I would like to say that the aim should not be on relying on large scale CDR, and we might discuss, you know, in the questions or so on, why not, but have ambitious emission reductions from all sectors and also behavior changes. So with this, Janos, I think that I just, you know, gave an overall picture of the CDR. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll come back to some of these points, but thank you very much, Thelma, and welcome to this event. Now let me go to Martin. Martin Frick, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Janos, and hello, everybody. My name is Martin Frick. I just joined the team around Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who is the special envoy for the UN Secretary General's Food Systems Summit in 2021. I've been before a senior director with UNFCCC, and before that, the climate change director of FAO. And my angle to that is actually since many years, the combination of food systems, agricultural systems, land use and climate change. And because I'm coming from a background of human rights, I really believe that the interface between the 2030 agenda, which is basically about poverty eradication, and the imperative of staying below 1.5 degrees really come together in the way we are producing, consuming, and distributing our food. And so when we are speaking about forests, I see forests as a part of our food systems. Forests are incredible storages for water also. They prevent landslides, and some of the innovative technologies that we are having is actually agroforestry, that we are basically combining the best of forestry with the best of agriculture. I think by means of introduction, it's important in all of these discussions not to create any hopes that there is one silver bullet, because in fighting climate change, we need absolutely everything. We need drastic reductions of emissions to zero, and we need removal of carbon out of the atmosphere. And the most functioning way, obviously, and I just checked that again, it's since 3.5 billion years operational, is photosynthesis. That basically cracks with the help of sunlight CO2 into carbon and oxygen, and both is extremely useful because the former you can eat and the latter you can breathe. So yeah, maybe one sentence to the Food Systems Summit. This is just started with our first advisory committee. There will be 5 action tracks looking into that. One is particularly about the planetary boundaries, and here's an open invitation to participate. And wherever you are in the world, we will bring food systems dialogues to every country of the UN to trigger local and regional discussions around food. We will have a quite exciting open network of champions. And so if anyone out there feels particularly strongly about this nexus between food, poverty, and environment, here's an open invitation. You find us on the internet. And with that, back to you, Janos.
Thank you, Martin. And you just set ourselves a new standard for sustainability, 3.5 billion years. That's quite a challenge. Okay, before going on to the next Li Fang, I just want to remind our participants, if you have a question, please post them on the Q&A part of the app, not on the chat, on the Q&A, please. Thank you. All right, so next would be Li Fang. Li, you have the floor.
Thank you, Janos, inviting me to hear very interesting topic. I'm the country director of World Resources Institute in China office. And my colleagues and I come here. We have the strong team since WRI is a leading very important research for Chinese government, soft commodity supply chain. It's closely related to the food supply chain. It's becoming more and more important after or during COVID-19, since we believe that food and land system released more than 30% of the world greenhouse gas emission. And also we believe that food or soft commodity supply chain is a kind of the remedy for global governance or good global governance, since it is related to the climate mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and food security. Before I joined the WRI, I have been working for MEE, Ministry of Ecology and Environment, for more than 20 years. I was in charge of preparation of the COP15. So I think that topic is really linked to the climate and biodiversity. And that is true boundary, planet boundary. Echo Martin's word on that. And I'm going to share with you about some good practice in China on the farm eco redlining and farmland redlining. It's a good combination between the food supply and eco-conservation. The two key elements of the policy are compulsory and physical instrument. The policy or strictly regulation without disturbing by the city expanding and economic development. So it's really strict, and it's a part of the local government performance review indicators. And second, the payment for farmers for protection and afforestation and subsidies the local government from central government for the national park conservation. So that is a kind of using market mechanism and also the laws and regulation, the carrot and stick. And result is 2020, the forest is increased 40 million hectares and 1.3 billion cubic meter compared to 2005. So it's already included by NDC. So that is one of the example I want to share. That is there is some way that we can balance that. But if we look at the globally, it's necessary to joint efforts, not just working within one country. So my colleagues, Xiao Liang, will join the discussion, and he's an expert on CCS and CDR. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. Okay. Thank you very much. Then now I'd like to ask Arthur to say a few words. Arthur Runge-Metzger.
Yeah, my name is Arthur Runge-Metzger, and I am working with the European Commission, particularly dealing with European policies. And at the present point in time, what we are looking at is the European Green Deal that has been announced by the EU Commission. And that is there to achieve climate neutrality by the year 2050. And there I think I can pick up immediately from where Thelma ended, because the IPCC Special Report 1.5 was guiding us in these deliberations. Only that we were looking not just at CO2 neutrality by 2050, but we would like to accomplish all greenhouse gas emissions at net zero by the year 2050. And like it or not, and I think Thelma said it, it requires you to have a very close look at agriculture and forestry. Because in the year 2050, the remaining emissions that you have, and we talk here about emissions reductions well beyond 90% in Europe, but the remaining ones are to a large extent agricultural emissions, things that you cannot reduce, like methane emissions. And those remaining emissions you will have to balance fully in line with what is said in the Paris Agreement in order to make sure that you will not do any harm to the climate. And even if we were to look beyond the year 2050, we would have to become net negative. And therefore, carbon dioxide removals are going to be important. And I think the bandwidth has been explained very well by Thelma, because depending on how much you reduce in the early years, that will determine how much of these carbon dioxide removals you need in the later years. And I think if you look at the European model, we don't believe in the P4 scenario, where reductions come very late and you will have to have up to, I think it's around 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide removals. We believe we'll have to reduce as much as we can, and then the residual you will have to look at in terms of carbon dioxide removal. So if you look at the European equation, what we would require with the current scenarios we are looking at is something like 500 million tons of carbon dioxide removal on the basis of nature-based solutions. And that is significantly more than what we are having at the present point in time. Because in Europe, we still have a net sink that is quite significant, but we would have to enhance that sink. And as you cannot create a sink from one day to the other, but we are now talking about the year 2050, we'll have to start now to think of the policy, how to enhance carbon dioxide removal. Mm-hmm. If you look at nature-based solutions, I think most of them have been mentioned already, whether it is afforestation, reforestation, but it's also the restoration of ecosystems in Europe. I think in the past 100, 200 years, we have taken into cultivation a lot of our peatland. That is a big emitter still on the side of agriculture. So here we are thinking of re-wetting, for instance. And in order to get there, of course, we need to incentivize farmers to do this. So one of the concepts that we are playing around with is what some people call carbon farming. And that not only goes for agriculture, but it also goes for forestry. And there's quite a lot of interest in the different member states. And many of them have started with pilot activities. I mentioned the peatlands. There's a project in northern Germany called More Futures. So that is a system where they try to give incentives to communes to restore the wetlands in those areas and to pay on the basis of performance, very much what Fang Li was also mentioning, what is being thought of in China. From the policy side, what we want to do in the coming 2 to 3 years is to collect as many examples in Europe as possible, and then see what we can learn from those in terms of also the governance structure on how do you make sure that you have really captured CO2 and it's not a fake ton of CO2 that you have captured. And then one particular issue, Thelma, you were mentioning, is the whole issue of permanence, which then also links to liability, particularly if you say one sector is removing the carbon dioxide, but another sector is using it in order to balance their residual emissions with it. So how does that work? And we have set ourselves a time frame of the next 3 years to develop such a system of certification. And we will do that together with farmers and foresters, with civil society, with the private sector. And that should become the new framework and governance framework in Europe. Final point I want to make is, of course, we know we are not living on an island in Europe. Particularly food chains go all across the world. So we will have to think beyond our borders to say what is happening, where does the soybean come from in Europe, where does the palm oil come from in Europe, and what does it mean in terms of direct and indirect land use changes in other parts of the world. This is a very difficult issue. Everybody who has been in the UNFCCC negotiations for more than a month will immediately know how difficult an area this is. So it's also going to be important to have talks like this, but also take them into the UNFCCC in the medium term again to see how can we resolve this so that the overall solution is a solution and not a fake solution where we just reshuffle carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from one part of the world to the other, because that's definitely not a solution to the climate problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. And our last introductory speaker, Kelsey Perlman, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I work on climate and forestry policies in the European Union for an organization called FERN. And today I'm also speaking on behalf of CAN International. So the point that I wanted to raise is about the need to address a multiplicity of variables when we talk about nature-based solutions. And I'm happy to hear that a lot of the presenters up until this point have mentioned the importance of SDGs, the need to really see how sustainable a massive amount of negative emissions might potentially be. But generally, I think we need to make sure that we're not just solving for carbon dioxide emissions, and that we're using the discussion to also identify human and climate caused degradation and identify what sort of activities we can then use to respond to that, which may have as sort of a co-benefit some negative emissions that are produced a little bit down the line. Because when we talk about natural negative emissions, it's quite clinical. It sounds like quite clinical of a term. And we need to sort of triple check that we are also considering lessons learned from previous types of either afforestation projects or other types of nature-based solutions, especially when it relates to consulting local and indigenous populations, looking at other ecosystem services beyond absorbing CO2, making sure that we're also taking into account the fact that our forests are more fragile in the light of climate change, so that when we do pursue policy choices around nature-based solutions, that they're not causing harm, which is why I think that the question generally about how much negative emissions that we need is a dangerous question and can be approached from a different angle. So you know, Thelma has already touched on it, but it's difficult to go into the IPCC scenarios that rely on significant amounts of negative emissions. And there are some IPCC authors that would come forward and say that these scenarios that rely much more heavily on removals are really more of a computer pipe dream than they would be feasible in reality because of some of the sustainability limits. And one that I would point to is the amount of bioenergy that are used in some of the scenarios. Have been some that have come forward, an author of the IPCC basically saying this is over in some of the higher scenarios like P3 and P4, this is a higher amount of bioenergy than the IPCC itself would consider sustainable. So, you know, there are real questions about the ecological limits of relying on really a large amount of nature-based solutions. So understanding that, we can approach the discussion from a little bit different of a perspective and looking at sort of what types of activities could we undertake that would repair what has become unsustainable. And then we can start looking at some of the large-scale problems in the world of forestry and agriculture that have not yet been resolved. So you can look at things like the report that just came out at the end of last year on the New York Forum for Forests, where they had their 5-year assessment of the state of affairs in forests, and it was not very positive. It basically showed that since 2000 all the way up to 2018, the rate of tree cover loss has increased by 43%. So that's definitely a challenge that can be tackled and will have as a result the production of negative emissions. You can look at the state of biodiversity in the recent IPBES report saying that up to 1 million species are currently threatened, and understanding that we have degradation across all continents that need to be addressed. And then, of course, the increase in pests and droughts everywhere that will require adaptation strategies that are coherent. So when we start to see where these issues are, you start to see more clearly where we should focus, what sorts of activities we should undertake, and especially who we should be talking with. So, you know, here comes the question of making sure that we're talking to indigenous populations that are sitting on top of upwards of 300 gigatons of carbon that is stored in lands across the globe. So, you know, I'll end this by saying that this topic of natural negative emissions really underlines the importance, and it's already been mentioned, but of linking the climate and the biodiversity agendas. Because when you start looking at areas that need to be addressed and you start thinking of restoration and, you know, what you can achieve when you link a locally determined restoration agenda and start delivering on those activities, you realize that that is a much better risk strategy because it's tackling so many things beyond CO2 than basically allowing anybody or anyone to plant a tree anywhere, which I think many of the experts around the table would agree is not necessarily the best strategy. So I think making sure that the conversation stays very wide and we address things that go far beyond CO2 is very important in the governance discussion about how we do this correctly and avoid repeating mistakes from the past. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelsey. And we're a little bit behind our schedule, but we have time for a little bit of discussion now before we open the Q&A. I would just like to remind the participants that don't just put up your questions, but if you like a question there, please vote on it. As I said, that will raise it in the list of priorities and hopefully will have a higher chance of it being responded to. So we've heard many interesting points here. Thank you. And I have enough questions that could keep us busy for many, many hours. But let me start by something that is often referred to as the moral hazard. And I would actually like to start with Thelma, but maybe the others can pitch in as well, is that the problem of, you did say, Thelma, in your presentation in the beginning that, of course, it's essential that we have the emissions reduced. And a number of other colleagues have also addressed that. But still, many people who are involved in this discussion are worried that this will just simply introduce this moral hazard, that it will take away the pressure from doing what we really have to do first, which is the emission reduction. So how can we address that? Not just that part of the moral hazard, but on the other side, that maybe we're overhyping the role of trees in removing carbon because of their relatively limited potential compared to what we might have to do. So if we can try to look at this moral hazard from at least these two different perspectives. And I'll ask Thelma to start, but then if any of the speakers would like to pitch in on that, please do. And then we'll come to the balance between the different issues, because that's, I think, the most interesting part. So Thelma, please.
Okay, so thank you, Janos, for the question and the provocation, I would say. Yes, obviously, in the ideal world, you would say that everybody, you know, all the countries would do their business in terms of emission reductions in all sectors, which is difficult. I think that I mentioned basically the CO2, the carbon dioxide, but obviously, you know, the IPCC said parallel to zeroing the CO2 emissions by around 2050, we would have also to have parallel reductions in all known CO2 emissions as well, in particular, you know, methane, which besides, you know, helping to mitigate climate change, would also contribute to a better health. So I think that sometimes we don't see all these co-benefits of doing things. And this is an issue that I think that we should make more visible to people. You're not doing this only, you know, you're not only mitigating climate change, but you're bringing added, you know, co-benefits into this that are incredibly high. So trees, obviously, Janos, you know, there is a big contribution, mitigation contribution from trees, but we have several complexities, especially if we go large scale, afforestation, reforestation. We see lots of initiatives worldwide. We see, I could name several. In China, you know, planting lots of trees, in India, in Canada, so in Europe at large. So, you know, even if I go to Brazil, and this year Brazil has 14 million hectares of afforestation, reforestation. So you are talking about, you know, every country doing this, but this would be small scale. When we really move into big scale, what we are talking in this large scale implementation, then I think that it becomes a little bit worrisome and depends very much on where you're doing this. So a lot of research is still going on. So despite the fact that we know a lot about, you know, bioenergy being implemented in many countries, afforestation and reforestation goes basically everywhere. But, you know, when we are talking about enlarging the scale of implementation, and if we think about the speed and the size of this, the scale of implementation, this would be a huge challenge and in different parts of the world. And in some of them, these large scale could really be detrimental. Like, you know, research is being developed in the boreal regions to see if large scale, you know, reforestation would be positive or would be negative. But anyway, just to respond to your question, I think that everyone should be aware of the many areas where we can bring, you know, decarbonization of the energy supply, you know, changes in behavior, which we in the IPCC, you know, put a lot of emphasis into, you know, possibly taking the pressure over land for grazing, for instance, you know, meat or other carbon intensive foods, let's say. So there are several ways that, you know, everyone can bring a contribution that would avoid us to have to rely to large scale anything but large scale emission reductions in all sectors.
Thank you, Thelma. Kelsey, I think you would like to react also.
Yes, I think, something that's quite important when you get to practical implementation on the ground is really separating out individual sectors and seeing what's necessary to transform the agriculture system or transform the forestry sector. And I think where things can get tricky is when we start seeing that emissions reductions are not ambitious enough on the side of other heavy industries. And then we immediately mirror how many negative emissions are necessary on the other side. I think, it's neat to present that in a decarbonization scenario because it makes the story very clear for people. But I think in the end, we really need to look at the problems on the ground in the land sector and basically see what is possible to resolve there sustainably. Otherwise, we're going to get into a very difficult conversation where we may see some sectors delaying in a way that is not sustainable and using negative emissions to sort of justify a continued business as usual pathway, which we're already seeing with many questionable corporate pledges. So I think decoupling the needed emission reductions from the very large potential for natural negative emissions is an important way to prevent this sort of delay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Unless any of you would like to follow on this, I'd like to throw in another topic because a number of you have raised the issue of balancing different components: food, biodiversity, carbon, of course, since that's what we're starting with, and so on. So, and also mentioning different ways of doing it. Lee, you talked about carrot and stick. Arthur, you talked about incentivizing. And Martin, you talked about at the global level how you balance these different big picture things. So I'd like to see if we can have a little discussion about this, and maybe starting with Lee, if you could sort of ask Arthur of how he does the incentives and have an exchange between the two of you of how it looks like in the EU and China. And then we come to Martin, and then any of you who would like to join into that discussion will be more than welcome. And I can just see that there are quite a few questions coming up, so we will probably switch to the question and answer mode in a few minutes because there's a lot of interest out there. So Lee, you.
Thank you, Janos, raising this question. Not so difficult, but it's really need cooperation with Europe, and especially for food supply chain. According to WRS recent research, that is, although China is the biggest consumer or buyer country in soybean and second buyer of the palm oil and some other soft commodities. And if we look at the carbon footprint, since if you look at in detail, China buy those issues in the south part of the Brazil, and that part is deforestation less than north part of the Brazil. Then however, for the other country, the carbon footprint is even higher than China. It surprised me. And so that means we really need the cooperation in that issues. And it's related to COVID-19, people more emphasize on food supply chain, security of the supply chain. And also, if we think about the sustainable trade issues, that relate to the global trade system. And it's also the sensitive time for the world to think about the trade or rethink about how about the trade can help the sustainable development. And beside of that, I do believe the green finance, or in Europe, you call it the sustainable finance, that's really helpful. Last weekend, we talked with the CBIRC, China Bank and Insurance Regulatory Committee. They have really positive idea on how the banks can support such kind of the sustainable activities or giving some incentive to those good performance. So thank you for raising that question. We are eager to cooperate with the EU especially there are so many opportunities in biodiversity, in high-level dialogue. So looking forward to that.
Thank you.
And
so Arthur, any quick
provide some technical support.
Just to say, we look as much forward as Fang Li is looking forward. I think one has to look at the different levels very clearly in terms of what are we going to try to do in Europe, where we want to promote sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture, taking also into account, and I think Kelsey made the point very well, the challenges that come with climate change, because we know that we will have to look at our forests and to change the structure of the forest if we want to have forests in 30, 40, 50, 60 years time. Because at the present point in time, many trees are dying in the forest. So there are some species that are no longer really adapted to the local circumstances. The second thing is that you want to incentivize doing more on carbon dioxide removals. At the same time, and I think several have said that, you don't want to loosen your efforts on the reductions in other sectors. So for instance, therefore, and I think that is something, Thelma, you remember back when we designed the Kyoto Protocol system, there was always a tendency to keep these two systems apart. And that's also what we're doing at the present point in time in Europe. So we regulate the sectors outside LULUCF differently from the LULUCF sector. But what we also recognize is that this is not yet giving sufficient acknowledgement to the carbon value that we assign to carbon dioxide removal. At the moment, member states can do this by using creatively the common agriculture policy, but it's not happening to the extent. So this side of incentives, direct incentives for farmers to start doing more on carbon dioxide removals and also foresters, that is going to be important to develop in the coming years without falling into the trap that today already you use all these offsets so that nobody else needs to do something. Yeah. Then I think the other question is, of course, a lot of the carbon dioxide removals with the present technologies we have in mind can be done through the use of bioenergy if you link that again to carbon capture and storage. But also there, we need to be careful in terms of what's the real potential here and what does it mean, because these things then move straight beyond your own borders. Kind of, if you look at what happened in the power sector in Europe, where at a large or on a large scale in coal plants, coal was kicked out of the energy mix and forest products were brought in. This is done to quite an extent also through imports from outside Europe. And of course, we cannot legislate outside Europe, but we still have to look at the sustainability footprint in one way or the other. We have tried that on the basis of the UNFCCC, but I'm not sure whether that is going to be really effective. So that's another area. And then the whole area of Fang Li, you were mentioning the supply chains. And I think first and foremost here, we need to have more transparency on, we all talk about the carbon footprint and it's more easily said than done. So also seeing where is this coming from, what does it do? But even if we know where it's coming from, it might have indirect effects in a completely different place in this world. And we have had this discussion to a larger extent in Europe when looking at biofuels for the past 10 to 15 years, where I think even with the modeling that was done by IFPRI and other international institutes, you can see, yes, there is an indirect effect that trickles down very far down the supply chain. Sometimes people do not think of that you replace something in Brazil and then it kind of pops up in Indonesia or so. So kind of these international linkages we need to better understand, and there needs to be transparency. And here we have invested a lot in Europe also to make sure that we help national governments to do the monitoring properly. And I mean here particularly the remote sensing. Even in Europe, it's like another check you can do on everything that is being measured and reported and you can do that in real time. And you can then also see the extent of the damage that is being done. At the moment, we're experiencing this heat wave in Siberia, which has led to huge peatland fires and forest fires. And I think with the satellite imaging, at least we know what is happening there and how much is being released into the atmosphere to have a rough calculation. And these are, of course, also big things in the larger equation. Sometimes we think about in Europe about hedgerows here and hedgerows there. And then at the same time, you have hundreds of square kilometers burning somewhere else because of climate change. So it's a quite complex picture, and you have to look at the different levels in the coming years in much more detail.
Thank you, Arthur. And you talked about the relationship, between Indonesia and Brazil. Martin, just very briefly, because we don't have much time, but if you could look at the big picture, you talked about the balance between these different aspects of biodiversity, food, carbon, but each of these have their own governance structures internationally. How does one deal with that?
That's a good point. I mean, in all of the 17 SDGs and almost 200 indicators, it's incredibly complex, and you add the climate agenda to it. But if you are on a piece of land, it suddenly becomes manageable. And I think the key the key issue to really understand the complexity and work with it is the way in which we look at smallholder farmers. And I'm saying smallholders because they are still the people who nourish 70% of the world. They are the large majority of the poorest of the planet. And it's maybe the biggest unharnessed possibility to fix the climate crisis if we only start to understand that they are not only supposed to squeeze out the last bit of productivity out of a piece of land to produce food, but it's in their very hands that many of our life support systems can be rebuilt. And remote sensing, and I think the progresses in remote sensing combined with progresses in blockchain technology can, as a vision, really give us a system in which small farmers worldwide might be able to sell on a global market a commodity which is really sought after, and that would be CO2 sequestration. There are all sorts of difficult questions here, and one of the big questions really is governance, and how do you get that money to the smallest smallholder farmers? But I think technologically, we are very close to really have direct interactions. And in terms of fighting poverty, that would be a change of a paradigm, because then these poorest people of the planet wouldn't be recipients of AIDS, but they would be business partners providing us with something that we urgently need. And back to you, Janos.
Perfect. Well, that's really good. And that, of course, will involve lots of consultation with those farmers, indigenous people, as Kelsey reminded us earlier. Now, Paul, thanks you for joining us also in picture, and I see lots of questions. So why don't we try to pose a few of them? We obviously can't deal with all the questions because there were many, at least not within the 60 minutes that we have. So Paul, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good day to everybody. Thanks for all the questions that have come in. The first one, the one that was most popular, Janos, was what are the obstacles for large-scale CDR globally, which came from Brian McHugh. And I'll give you two, and then you can select. And then another one was it's a collective of questions. Ben Farwood posed a question around research, and Mary Valentine Florin also had a question around research. And this is, to what extent is current research, so recent modelling from Bronson Griscom, for example, driving the policy solutions and priority settings? And how aware are people of in those processes of new research, and how can you deal with the uncertainty in that research? There's a great deal of uncertainty within the net benefits of nature-based approaches. So what kinds of research should be done, how, and so on to achieve a sustainable, effective, and socially acceptable future?
Fantastic. So let's have a go. And so there are really two questions, and we can just open the discussion on both. The first is, what are the obstacles? And the second one is, what kind of research? I'd like to add to that second question is that, should we do more research before making big plans for carbon removal using trees, or not? So who would like to take a first go at this? Either the research or the obstacles? Thelma, please.
Well, I'll go for the research very quickly so that everybody can have a go. There was one point that I didn't mention, that IPCC does note in the report, both the global warming of 1.5 and also the land report also that came after, that large scale afforestation, reforestation is unproven, the benefits. So there is a lot of let's say research needs to see the potential implications of large scale on soil, on nutrient cycle, on water demand, on biodiversity. Even there is no single answer that if you reforest is going to be beneficial, to biodiversity, for instance. And also, I already mentioned the issue on albedo, what you plant and where you plant, which might not be as beneficial in the boreal regions as it might be in the tropical regions, because of the dynamics of the systems in tropical, which makes the greatest potential for the net temperature reduction in the tropics than it's in the boreal. Is in the temperate regions, this is still a research issue. So it's not quite there yet. So the literature today is still lacking a comprehensive review on the topic of the albedo and the larger scale implications to soil, water, biodiversity, and many other sustainable development goals. Yeah, just to be quick.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Anybody else starter, please?
I think, to be very short, I think what is the biggest obstacle in the European context at the moment is that on the LULUCF side, carbon is not valued, while timber is valued, biomass is valued, everything that's related to food production is valued in the market, but it's not yet carbon. So therefore, I think we are not moving towards an optimal state. And when it comes to research, I think the biggest question I personally have is, how are the forests going to develop with climate change, and what is the optimum then in the future? At the moment, kind of the modeling we are doing is like of, the forests will stay as they are and they will continue to deliver, but that is just not happening. And I think we need to put much more money into saying, what is the dynamics in which these forests are going to change in the coming decades, to better understand, will we really have this huge potential that we believe today that we will have? And that is kind of trying then to reduce the uncertainty that you have at the present point in time.
Okay, thank you. I think unless there is a burning desire by anybody else to respond, I would ask Paul to come, and I think we can address one or two other questions. Thelma, quickly, please.
Yeah, very quickly. I don't think that we address the issue of the species that we plant. So many people say we should be planting native species, and others say, well, we can have a fast growing species that would contribute much more to the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. So essentially, maybe a mix of both would be the ideal situation. And also, just to be quick, we don't know yet, as Arthur has mentioned, the implications of climate change. We don't know if the native species would be resilient to climate change. So that's a point that I think it's important to reflect, and an issue for research as well.
Okay, Kelsey, please.
Yeah, so I think I would agree in the need for research on the ground to see, which trees are going to adapt in specific situations. And I would also agree that the literature around the question of how many or how much removals can we achieve is fraught with a lot of discussion, and I think that's still open. But if you paint the picture of what is given by IPCC science, IPBES science, what we know through common sense of seeing forests being chopped down and the effect that has on wildlife, I think it should not be an obstacle that prevents us from putting good common sense policies in place to reverse damage that we have seen for years and years. So I wouldn't let some of these research questions prevent some of the answers that we all know are right in front of us and are very cheap and accessible.
Thank you. Paul.
Hey, thank you. So following on actually quite nicely from that, and Arthur's comments about valuing timber but not carbon, we have a suite of questions around deforestation from Tijo Joe, Rolf Schmitz, Susan Erdling, saying plainly planting trees simply isn't a solution. It's not enough unless deforestation is resolved or stopped. How can that happen? how can deforestation be addressed, particularly when timber is being used in bioenergy, for example?
Thank you. That's a easy one. Anybody would like to have a first go at that? Arthur, and then Thelma.
I think the link between deforestation and bioenergy, I think that's probably to a lesser extent happening, because what we see is, at least in Europe, kind of the bioenergy that you get from forests is mainly coming from managed forest. So one of the purpose of that forest is also using residues and so on for bioenergy, while the kind of the logs are used for pulp, paper, timber, you name it. Many things that are also important to battle climate change, because it's about material substitution. If you look at the construction sector, cement produces a lot of CO2. If you would use wood in many places, kind of you would have a much smaller carbon footprint and something that you can much more easily recycle in the economy. So I think the deforestation issue, as far as I can see, is very much linked to the demand for food products. So it's agriculture driving a lot of that deforestation across the world. So I think that is something where we need to look at, what are the types of foods we are consuming and what are we using those things for? So I think there we need to have a debate. And that is kind of not easily to stop from one day to the other. On the contrary, and Martin, you come from the FAO, you know the numbers in terms of if consumption in terms of livestock products continues to rise and the size of the middle class in the whole world is going to rise, demand for meat products is going to go up. And that means you will have the impacts on land use. I think that is something that requires a much deeper discussion.
Thank you. Thelma, and then Lee. And then there is a big challenge from Martin for the Food System Summit, but we'll come back to that. Thelma.
Okay, all right, very quickly. So it's a challenge if you want to say, have deforestation zero everywhere. Globally, it's going to be a challenge. But if I take my IPCC hat off, I'm gonna, bring a little bit of the Brazilian experience. Like, you know that we still have 80% of the Amazon, biome, forest in the Amazonian biome standing up. So there is a lot of forest over there, and obviously we wanted to keep it. We have been successfully reducing deforestation, or had been successful in reducing deforestation from 2004 to 2012. 80% of reduction in deforestation in this very short period of time. Now, obviously, there are other, political interests, but it is very interesting that in Brazil, because Arthur mentioned the issue of, deforestation for agriculture. In Brazil, the agribusiness says we don't need to chop down a single tree in Amazonia to continue our business. and even enhancing it. So I would go about to say that, you know, obviously reducing emissions from deforestation is much better than having had to rely on large scale afforestation and reforestation because of the time that we have in terms of, you know, the emissions from deforestation, which in developing countries are basically instantaneously oxidized because we don't know too much on harvest wood products. So that's the basically issue of afforestation and reforestation, taking a long time, especially with native species, to really recover that amount of biomass that or carbon that was lost to the atmosphere from the deforestation. So there needs to be this understanding. Although I can see that in some parts of the world, deforestation is a need to, as Arthur said, to expand agriculture and pasture. Yeah.
Thank you, Thelma. And I'm afraid we've run out of time, and it's terrible because we're talking about trees. So I feel like here's an iceberg. We've just touched the tip of the iceberg. There are so many issues here that we may just have to do a follow-up campfire on this one, I'm afraid. But I would like to thank, first of all, our guests for the time they have put together to speak on these complex issues. I would like to thank all the participants who joined us and the many questions that they posed. I'm afraid we could not get to all of them, but we'll try to find a way to deal with them. So thank you very much. And this has been a fantastic contribution to governance, that part of governance, which is about engaging different stakeholders in a conversation about challenging issues and trying to find solutions. So thank you very much. And have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.